We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Planet Holyrood, the podcast all about Scottish politics. I'm Chris McCall. I'm the Deputy Political Editor at the Daily Record, and I'm standing in this week for regular host Paul Hutchin, who's busy making a start on his Christmas shopping. Joining me in the studio this week are Mark Smith, the Head of News at the Daily Record, and Douglas Dickie, the Content Editor at the Scottish Daily Express. Now, this week, John Swinney spoke to a room full of SNP members and some invited journalists in Glasgow, and he had a couple of big pre-election claims. One of them was the First Minister said that in the event of independence, electricity bills in Scotland could drop by more than a third, which he summed up with a political slogan which might sound familiar. The First Minister confidently told us that it's Scotland's energy, which echoes, of course, that famous "It's Scotland's oil" slogan from the 1970s, back when the SNP were making a big breakthrough down at Westminster. Before I come to our panellists, I just want to say that I was in the room for this speech, and I've got to say it wasn't the best that I've heard from the SNP leader. It definitely smacked of an event with an eye on May's election rather than, a big serious policy commitment. But Dougie, I'll come to you first. Is it Scotland's energy? And if not, whose is it?
Well, it's the energy belongs to whoever captures it. I suppose, unlike oil, which you need to extract, you just extract, it's there. This energy is, I talk about wind energy, wave energy. This stuff needs to be captured. There'll be private companies on the whole who kind of capture that.
It's an expensive business.
It is an expensive business. It's subsidised heavily currently from by UK taxpayers, of course. John Swinney made a big deal about how we would be needing to pay for nuclear subsidies that down south. I find the SLP's opposition to nuclear really strange, but kind of move on for that. He, of course, had absolutely nothing to back up his claim about cutting it by a third. And quite frankly, I find the whole thing a bit xenophobic, to be honest. I want to paint a picture. My colleague Ben wrote on this, but the biggest wind farm in the world is currently being built off the east coast of England. And if you want to imagine Nigel Farage in Hull saying to his supporters, all this energy flowing north to Scotland, this is England's energy, we're subsidising Scotland. I can imagine how the left-wing press, yourselves included, might react to something like that. Frankly, I thought the whole thing was quite pathetic. A party and a leader who looks out of ideas, desperately trying to shore up his core support, which come to later is maybe all he needs to do right now. And it was just a bit. I find the whole thing quite sad.
So you're not sold on the claim that we're...
No. Well, apart from anything else, it's another example. The SNP are very good at this. Because they know ultimately they're probably not going to need to back it up. And even if they did have to back it up, it would be too late by then. So they say, we'll cut your energy bills by a third. They don't provide any evidence of this. They don't show how it's going to work. But they know that, well, it doesn't matter because we're not independent. Then if we were independent, if they didn't drop by a third, what does it matter?
Just on that point, I'll come to you in a second, Mark, to show you how sort of underwhelmed other sections of the media are, not just you guys at the Express. I was speaking to a chap from the National, obviously very, very pro-independence, and they pointed out to me that, John Swinney talked a lot about communities should be earning more from particularly wind developments, and saying that more money should be staying on a local basis than profits flowing south, etc. And he made the point that the SNP government currently have the powers to do that. Planning laws basically meaning they could do that right now. There's no need to wait for independence. And he actually did write a column in the National saying this, basically saying, "Well, I'm extremely underwhelmed by John Swinney's speech for these reasons."
I mean, I think when John Swinney loses the National, like that's I think I think he's spin doctor. I've got to go back to the drawing board then and say, well, hold on a second. Yeah.
Mark, did you take more from it? Were you more impressed?
I think he's only a winner, yeah. I think he's only a winner. I mean, I remember a great poster from the 80s, and it was Maggie Thatcher done up like a vampire with the blood dripping. It wasn't blood, it was oil dripping down her teeth.
Chris and I are a bit young to remember this.
Usually remember that, and it was It's Scotland's Oil. And as you all know, It's Scotland's Oil as a slogan basically propelled the SNP for a tartan-clad pressure group into a serious party of Scottish political life. That one thing. So Swinney's no daft. He knows that resonates. And we're in a similar situation again. I mean, there's a reason they're building big cables to take energy from Scotland into England. They're doing it because Scotland is one of the most energy-rich countries on earth in terms of the hydropower, potentially wave power, wind power. We've got massive resources, and people quite rightly look at that and say, "Why are our bills so high?" And it was Labour's big idea, and they still have a chance to succeed on this, to bring those bills down. They've not really done that. So John Swinney, being the wily old fox that he is, realises that there's a potential here to resuscitate an absolutely dynamite slogan from the past, and also address people's concerns about their massive bills that they have while living in a country which is massively energy rich. And it is Scotland's energy. That's the reason why they're building loads of cables to take it down south. Now, whether you're a nationalist or not, that's a compelling set of circumstances. And I think Swinney's only a winner there.
Sure, a good socialist like yourself, Mark, should want our energy to benefit everyone. Because he's
if it's what he pays for it, that's fine. You know what I mean? But
I mean, it's not Scotland's energy; it belongs to the company who
captures. You know how it works. If it's created in Scotland by a multinational company, we can tax it. We can control the revenue from it. We can use that revenue for
so we can tax that, but not tax the profits on the oil and gas. That's because it takes them. Yeah, but this is where the SNP are completely.
I did feel that was the elephant in the room.
Windfall tax, yes, but big tax on renewables.
That's the SNP's problem to solve. In my view, we should tax the oil and we should tax all other energy companies. They make a fortune. Let's get them taxed to the hilt for the benefit of us all, right? But I'm talking here about Swinney's political nous, and he knows that it's a vote winner. He knows that watching all that energy created here, sending it down south, and we're still paying massive bills, that is a vote winner. And and you know what? It doesn't even have to make much sense. Really, as long as it chimes with the voters, he's got an eye on the next election, and he knows that's a vote winner.
Okay, well, we'll speak about the next election and what voters think about the parties right now in a little bit, but we couldn't ignore the other, probably the biggest story of the week so far anyway, which is after 2 years of intense debate, recrimination, angry public demonstrations, the Employment Tribunal, brought by nurse Sandie Peggie, finally issued its report. It did rule that Sandie Peggie had been harassed by her employer, NHS Fife, after she'd complained about a trans colleague of hers, Dr. Beth Upton, who had been using a female changing room at the A&E ward at the Victoria Hospital Kirkcaldy. Now, I should add, this was a partial victory for Sandie Peggie. The tribunal did dismiss her claims of victimisation as well as her claims against Dr. Upton personally. So, there are absolutely questions for NHS Fife to answer, as opposition politicians stood up in Holyrood and said yesterday. And I should also add that all parties now have 2 weeks to consider the tribunal's ruling. So we could see an appeal on part of it, all of it, I don't know. But with a subject as contentious as this, my question is, given that no one seems particularly happy with what the tribunal said, Mark, I'll come to you first. Where on earth do we go from here?
Two things that I think should spring forth from this. First off, the entire leadership of NHS Fife should hang their head in shame, and they should already be gone for how they treated this nurse who had 30 years' experience. They harassed her in the findings of the tribunal were quite clear on that. And what was also quite clear is they did not take her legitimate concerns clearly. They didn't take them seriously. They were a disgrace. How they handled themselves throughout the tribunal, they were a disgrace. There are certain individuals within NHS 5 who I reckon have behaved unlawfully in how they've dealt with this. They should quit. And if they didn't quit, John Swinney, the First Minister, should be forcing them to resign. Now, no mucking about. Second thing that should come for this is that John Swinney should unequivocally and without any weasel words declare that women, biological women, are entitled to same-sex spaces, because it's not only what the Supreme Court ruled is the law, it's also the right thing politically to do. Now, that is what should spring forth from this right away. And what follows from that, I don't know. There probably will be an appeal, by the way, because some of the judgment is perverse in its lunacy. I mean, the judgment by this guy, Kemp, some of it looks like it's made up. Some of it looks like he's just ignored the law of the land. Some of it looks like he just didn't like Sandie Peggie, and some, because he didn't like the cut of her jib. So I think there will be an appeal. But that's the kind of thornier legal issue that will undoubtedly still keep going. And another thing, I know that Sandie Peggie is also suing her trade union. They were a disgrace in how they refused to help Sandie Peggie.
And which union was this?
It was the Royal College of Nursing.
Okay, right.
She's suing them, and rightly so, as somebody who's a trade unionist and has been all my life, to abandon one of your members like that, utter disgrace. So they ought to be taking a really close look at themselves as well. Before
I come to you, Dougie, I just wanted to say, so Neil Gray, the Health Secretary, when he spoke to MSPs yesterday, didn't really say much, but what I should just throw out there, the Scottish Government's position at the minute on this is the individual decisions and employment matters are a matter for NHS 5. But as a government, Neil Gray says, we will be considering the judgment very carefully for any issues that require further consideration, which you could say is kicking in the long grass as well as possible.
Ever since the Supreme Court ruling that we have...
That's what we've done. Yeah, that's what we've done.
Well, Gray also said they accept the Supreme Court ruling, we accept the judgment, and we're taking forward the detailed work necessary as a consequence. Now, there's nothing said in timescales, of course. No. And I think that's what a lot of other MSPs and other parties are saying is you need to give clear guidance to public bodies to avoid potentially other tribunals like this. Yeah. Very, very costly, businesses that suck up a lot of individuals who maybe don't want to be in the public eye like this.
What other area of law would it be declared by the Supreme Court that the law is the law? Say it was on murder. The Scottish Government can't just turn around and say, well, we'll take a bit of time to consider that guidance. Feel free to murder who you like in the meantime. The law is the law, and they ought to just be obeying the law and making sure it's obeyed among those institutions that they have power over. To muck about and equivocate, it's one of the worst looks that I've ever seen from a government. And although I've just been complimentary to the SNP about their energy stuff, they're an absolute disgrace on this, and they need to get it sorted for the good of all of us, so that we can finally get some clarity on this issue.
Do you your take on that?
Well, for a start, I think Smitty's absolutely right. This isn't over. I don't think by a long shot. I think Sandie Peggie will appeal. I think Smitty says is right about the judgment. It's very strange. It's very. I mean, I won't pretend to have read all 300 pages of it. I didn't flick through it in bed last night. But the parts I have seen. I mean, I don't know Sandie Peggie personally. I've never met her. I've no idea what kind of person she is. But it felt at times like she was on trial here. Her personality was on trial. And the judgment doesn't really do anything to kind of dissuade you from thinking that. So I think there's still a bit to run. I don't think... I'm unsure if NHS 5... I think they would be well advised by the government maybe not to appeal this, because you've already spent taxpayers' money to defend it. Which I mean, people are kind of... you said it yourself, Chris, it's a partial victory, narrow victory. But it was a victory on the main grounds. The main grounds was that she'd been harassed by NHS 5. That was her sort of central point, and she has been vindicated in that. I think I don't know if I detect a little bit of fatigue over this issue. starting to
I think so. Yeah.
starting to kind of hit home. The debate has been so fierce and so divisive over the past 3 or 4 years. I think basically since the GRR bill was kind of passed through Holyrood. This has been kind of front page news, and I've definitely detected over the past kind of 48 hours people are maybe a bit fed up with it. The Supreme Court judgment, I think, was a line in the sand moment, regardless of which side of the debate you're on. It was, as Smith says, it was clear. The law is clear. You can't just pick and choose which laws you want to obey based on whether you like them or not. It just, I mean, the whole thing has been tiring, and yet I think we're almost only at the beginning of it, because
That's it. I see what you're saying about fatigue. I mean, there's plenty of folk I know who are far from fatigued on it, by the way. They're up for the fight on it. But there's no doubt this is going to run and run, because there isn't really a halfway house in this one.
No.
You either have to have a situation where women are entitled to sex-based rights, or some men are entitled to those rights. I don't think there's a halfway house there.
I wonder if there is. It was kind of interesting because 10 years ago, to me, a transgender person was someone who had underwent an operation to remove certain bits or change certain bits, or in order to live their life in their chosen gender. And then it seemed to change, that all they had to do was kind of tick all you need to do is kind of tick something on a box, and then you could do it. I wonder if there's scope to move back to how it maybe felt that way 10 years ago. But then 10 years ago, this issue wasn't even on my radar. It wasn't on most people's radars.
I think just on the subject of issues becoming more salient, there's a good opportunity to move on from this, because I know we've said a lot about Sandie Peggie in this show before, and I'm sure a lot more will be said, but I'm conscious of time. And on an unrelated issue, well, it could be related to depending on how you're voting in May, but we had another poll out today. Now, we don't get substantive polling on the state of the Scottish parties anywhere near as often as you do with the state of the UK parties at Westminster. But we had a poll from IPSOS today, not to go into all the detail, but the headline is that the SNP remain out in front with 35% of the vote, which is pretty much where they were 6 months ago. But the two big ones, one is Labour. So they are down 7 points since June, which is truly dreadful for an Asawa, no matter how you look at it. But the other one, the one I want to talk about first, is Reform are up 4 points. But also in June, Ipsos asked voters what their top 10 priorities were ahead of the election. Immigration wasn't even mentioned, is now coming in at the third most mentioned. Now, that's, I said to you before we recorded this, Smite, that's probably because if you are a Reform voter, you will tell pollsters your number one issue is immigration. And that's shot up the rankings, so to speak. So I guess the obvious question is, are Reform going to continue to rise in the polls, and is there any way back for Labour?
Well, I think if you'd asked me this 2 weeks ago, I would have said the Reform, I think Reform's biggest problem is still going to be getting its people out to vote, because I think it's attracting the type of people who maybe don't normally vote, who felt disengaged from politics. And I would have said that once focus turns on the SNP's record in government, then I think Labour will, have some sort of fight back. Now I'm really not so sure, because this is such a devastating result for them. I mean, it's just awful, no matter how much you try and dress it up. I would say I sometimes feel Ipsos. I had a wee look back. I know you said that we don't get as much polling here, but I had a wee look back on previous polls. And Ipsos can be a bit of an outlier with stuff like the Green. I noticed the Greens in the regional vote was 17%.
Could double the number of MSPs.
Now, no one else is getting them anywhere close to that, apart from Find Out Now.
No, the less that they would find out now, the better.
But no one else is getting close to that. So there might be maybe it's inflating the Green vote. Is it also inflating the Reform vote? These kind of outsider parties. I don't know, but there's no way you can dress it up.
Politics is about momentum, and Reform seem to have obviously ignoring they have momentum UK wide, but in Scotland they do seem to have some momentum, whereas Labour in Scotland, it's been said here many times before, are paying the price because a lot of voters up here have decided they don't like your style of government.
I mean, by May next year, Scotland could be the most reform area of the UK in terms of elected, representation. Immigration, I know what you're saying about it's very much reform voters who are driving that. Immigration is now a bigger priority than the Constitution. We've been talking about independence and that kind of thing. It's now a bigger issue in voters' minds. They seem to be in charge of the narrative in Scotland reform at the moment. John Swinney's anti-far right summits really had the desired effect. Although maybe it has had the desired effect from his point of view, because
they consolidate their vote. I mean, just on that. I mean, we talked earlier in this episode about Swinney and at Scotland's Energy, but he also obviously took questions from journalists. There was a woman from Sky News, I forget her name, but she asked a very pertinent question about what the First Minister thought about the rise of reform in Scotland. And John Swinney made a very robust defence. He said, I'm not going to change my views. He said, I think the protests outside hotels, temporarily housing asylum seekers are appalling. He's basically just reminding SNP voters, we have a very clear view in immigration that it's the polar opposite to reform. They're talking about a core vote strategy.
Well, that's what he's set piece in Monday, boys. It's a core vote strategy.
Swinney's playing a dangerous game there by in opposing reform and making reform the focus of a lot of his attention. He's talking them up, and I think reform have benefited from their UK-wide surge because obviously immigration has become such a sort of keystone issue. But there's no doubt they've been talked up in Scotland by John Swinney, I think, because he's put them right to the heart of most of the things he's said. And it's deliberate, it's on purpose, because he wants this to be an election between Scottish nationalism and British nationalism, or Little England nationalism on the reform side. And if he can present himself as the flag waver for Scotland, then he thinks he'll pick up a lot of votes. And he wants this election to be an identity politics battle between him and Farage. And Labour, unfortunately, is caught in that squeeze, because it's wanting this election to be about services, about the NHS, about schools. And it cannot get its message across because it's being drowned out. And I feel sorry for Anna Sarwar. I don't think he's put a foot wrong. I think he's said the right things. He's got prescriptions for problems that Scotland is facing, proper problems, no the made up problem of immigration, and he's being squeezed out of the debate by Swinney and Farage. They're two cheeks of the same arse.
Just on that, I mean, looking at this poll by Ipsos talking about voter priorities, almost 60% of voters said that the state of the health service is their number one priority. Now, we all know that the health service in Scotland and in the rest of the UK has big challenges, but about a third of voters in Scotland still say the SNP are best placed to lead it, which is despite, every single week at First Minister's Questions. Now, I know not everyone's tuning in to that as much as I do, but every week, you hear terrible examples of patients have been let down and staff facing burnout and examples of the real problems the health service faces. But a third of voters still say, well, it's tough, but the SNP are best placed to handle it.
You probably see it yourself whenever you do a story about the health service. I certainly see it, in the Record Twitter feed and other places. You criticise the SNP over some sort of aspect of health delivery, and you get deluged by people saying you're a unionist troll or whatever. I think there are some people who will just say the SNP are great and whatever they do. You know what I mean? So I think that's part of the reason why that polling goes the way it does. However, there's got to be a lot of soft SNP voters who must be going at this next election saying that what, another 5 years of the SNP running their schools, their health services.
Yeah.
By the way, if they conclude that they do want that, that's fine. But,
I mean, you should say, they're still down 12 points at least on where they were in 2021. Mm-hmm. So it's not to say the SNP hasn't lost votes, it has. I mean, it's lost. I mean, they were almost running at 50%, in the height of COVID, obviously. And they're now running up at 35, which I know, a lot of people around John Swinney and John Swinney himself would probably argue, given the 2 years that they had with everything, leadership changes, blah, 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 they would bite your arm off for that.
Yeah.
And they are doing what they have to do, and it's working so far. But
it's quite remarkable with this poll that, we're kind of talking about the three top parties vying for position, the SNP, Reform, Labour. We don't even mention the official opposition. or as much as Scotland has an official opposition anymore.
Yes.
It just disastrous again for the Tories. Although
I think they're up a point.
I know it's a wee, the Russell Finlay bounce back maybe starting, but it's awful for the Tories.
Yeah,
Russell's a
Russell's a good performer. Russell's a good performer. So he's by the way, I mean, he used to work with Sunday well. I know Russell. He's a very astute political thinker, and I think he's got some good ideas. He's head of the Tories, so he's not going to get much support for the record. But I thought he might have had a bigger impact with the votes, and he's saying a lot of things that maybe reform guys might say as well. So I thought that might hold back reform a bit in Scotland, but I think the Farage effect is just steamroller and everything else on the right.
I think the point I was making there, similar to you with Anis Sarwar, in some ways it doesn't matter. What he says, events, dear boy, everything's overtaken Labour and the Tories. The narrative has overtaken them, and they're really struggling to get a grip back on it right now. I don't think the Tories will be able to get a grip back on it before May. Labour may yet still potentially have a chance. But I mean, it needs to happen pretty quick now. But May's getting awfully big in the window, and it ain't looking good.
I think on that note, we'll wrap it up. There'll be lots more of election predictions to come on this podcast for certain. But thanks very much to Douglas, and thanks to Mark for joining me. Thanks also to Daryl Devine and the Daily Records video team for producing this episode. You can listen to it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, watch it all on the Daily Records YouTube channel, and don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast. That's all from us just now, so a goodbye, and you can look forward to Paul Hutchin rejoining next week.
Can't wait.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.